going back and forth this week. I told him I was going to give him around 10 minutes, and he's been joking that he was going to take 45, and I said, that's all right. I said, kind of like a politician, you know, if you've ever listened to him speak on C-SPAN, they say they reserve the remaining balance of their time. Well, that's what I do at the end of every service every week. I reserve the remaining balance of my time. I just carry it over to the next week. So we're good, Gene. You could have taken 45 minutes and it would have been all right. I don't know how good they would have been, but
I didn't want to keep them gone too long.
All right, today we're going to begin a new series called The S's of Easter. And so I want you to stand with me, if you would, as we honor God's Word and read Matthew 26, beginning in verse number 36. This is what Matthew writes. Then Jesus went with his disciples to a place called Gethsemane. He said to them, "Sit here while I go over there and pray." He took Peter and the two sons of Zebedee along with him, and he began to be sorrowful and troubled. Then he said to them, "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Stay here and keep watch with me." Going a little farther, he fell with his face to the ground, and he prayed, "My Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me. Yet not as I will, but as you will." Then he returned to his disciples and found them sleeping. "Could you men not keep watch with me for 1 hour?" he asked Peter. "Watch and pray, so that you will not fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the body is weak." He went away a second time, and he prayed, "My Father, if it is not possible for this cup to be taken away, unless I drink it, may your will be done." When he came back, he again found them sleeping, because their eyes were heavy. So he left them, and he went away once more and prayed the third time, saying the same thing. He returned to the disciples, and he said to them, "Are you still sleeping and resting? Look, the hour is near. The Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us go. Here comes my betrayer." Father, I pray that today you would be our teacher. I pray that we would learn how to be victorious when we are faced with the struggle. In Jesus' name. A stranger was walking down a residential street one day, and he noticed a man who was struggling with a washing machine at the doorway of his house. When the newcomer volunteered to help, the homeowner was overjoyed, and the two men began to work and struggle with the bulky appliance. After several minutes of fruitless effort, the two stopped and they just stared at one another. They were frustrated that they were not making any progress at all, and they looked as if they were on the verge of exhaustion. Finally, when they caught their breath, the man said to the owner of the home, he said, "We'll never get this washing machine in there." The homeowner looked at the man and he said, "I'm trying to get this washing machine out of here." We know this story kind of illustrates the life of a Christian at times. There are moments in our life as Christians when God calls us to do something and a struggle begins within us. For example, God says to us, "I want you to serve in that ministry at church." Our spirit's willing. We're headed toward the door saying, "God, I would love to do that." We no more get the words out of our mouth, and we're met at the threshold of the door of our heart by our flesh. That natural part of us that's weak, that natural part of us that is inclined to sin. And our flesh begins to say, "You don't want to be a part of that ministry. You have to understand it's gonna be time consuming and it's gonna be hard work." And the struggle between our spirit and our flesh begins to take place at the doorway of our heart. Our spirit's trying to get us out of the door to do what God has called us to do, and our flesh is trying to keep us inside the door to not do what God has called us to do. Anybody know the struggle that I'm talking about? Anybody ever been there? Anybody ever experienced this struggle besides me? You know what it's like to have your spiritual nature and your human nature struggling for control at the doorway of your heart? It's an exhausting and frustrating struggle, isn't it? You know, there's a reason we experience this struggle. The flesh is all about doing that which seems naturally pleasing and fulfilling. And since sin promises pleasure and sin promises fulfillment, the natural inclination of the flesh is to what? Yield to sin. However, when we are saved, the Holy Spirit joins our spirit, and our spirit becomes alive unto God. And a spirit that is alive unto God is a spirit that desires to do that which is pleasing and fulfilling to God. And so our flesh, it wants to do that which is naturally pleasing, and our spirit wants to do that which is supernaturally pleasing. And so we have this struggle that takes place within us. It's a struggle that's familiar to every Christian. Now, it might interest you to know that when Jesus was on this earth, he experienced the struggle between the spirit and the flesh. Did you realize that? You realize that the struggle that you have experienced many times over, Jesus himself, when he was on this earth, he also experienced that struggle. Jesus, he was tempted to follow the inclinations of the flesh and do that which was naturally and pleasing and fulfilling. But here's the deal. While Jesus experienced the temptations of the flesh, he never gave in to them. The Bible is very clear about that. In Hebrews chapter 4, verse 15, it says this about Jesus. He has been tempted in every way, just as we are, yet without sin. And so Jesus, he understands the struggle between our flesh and our spirit. He is a sympathizer when it comes to this struggle. He knows what it's like to be called to do something and then feel the struggle begin between the flesh and the spirit. Jesus, he had been called to give his life on the cross for the sin of man. A number of occasions, Jesus spoke of this call in his life. Let me just give you a couple examples. Matthew 16:21, we read, from that time on, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, chief priests, and teachers of the law, that he must be killed and on the third day be raised to life. And then in Matthew 20:28, Jesus says, the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. And so Jesus, he knew what he'd been called to do. He knew his purpose for being on this earth. He knew that he had been called to go to the cross. But understand, it wasn't a call without a struggle. In the passage I just read, we see clearly a struggle taking place between Jesus' flesh and Jesus' spirit. And I want us to look further at this passage, and I want us to discover some things that will help us when we face the struggle, because Jesus is our example. He's the one we look to. And Jesus, he overcame the struggle. He was victorious over the struggle. And so we can look to him and we can see what we must do if we want to be victorious when we experience the struggle. The first thing I want us to discover today is the place. Verse 36 says that Jesus went with his disciples to a place called Gethsemane. Now that word Gethsemane means oil press. It was a place that was enclosed. It was an enclosed garden or an orchard. It was located about 3/4 of a mile from Jerusalem on the western slope of a hillside known as the Mount of Olives. We don't know how many olive trees were in this garden during the time of Jesus, but we do know that there are 8 olive trees standing within this enclosure today. We also know that the National Research Council of Italy in 2012 found that they were among the oldest trees known to science. And so my guess is that there were likely more than 8 olive trees in this garden during the time of Jesus, but that's mere speculation on my part. The most important thing to note is that Jesus chose it as a place to go and pray. Now Matthew tells us that when Jesus and the disciples got to Gethsemane, that Jesus said to them, sit here. And it's like he points and he says, I want you to sit here while I go over there and pray. Now, why did Jesus choose this place to pray? Why did Jesus choose the Garden of Gethsemane? Well, you know, I just want to suggest to you, again, it's your speculation on my part, but I want to suggest to you the reason Jesus chose Gethsemane as the place to go and pray is because it was a place of privacy. It was a place of extreme privacy. Gethsemane wasn't a place out in the open, but a place enclosed by walls. It was a place that was sheltered by olive trees. It was a refuge that Jesus could go to during this time of struggle where he could be alone. I think there's a good lesson we can learn here from Jesus. When we're in the middle of a struggle between our flesh and our spirit to do what God has called us to do, it's a good practice to go and find a lonely place to pray. Luke 5:16 tells us that Jesus often withdrew to lonely places and prayed. It's interesting that in John chapter 18, verse 2, we're told that Gethsemane was a place that Jesus often met with his disciples. And so I'm kind of thinking this wasn't the first time that Jesus went to Gethsemane to pray. In fact, I believe with all my heart that Gethsemane was one of the lonely places that Luke refers to that Jesus often withdrew to pray. This was kind of Jesus' go-to place when he was wanting to be alone, when he was wanting just to be alone with his disciples, maybe to teach them in privacy, or maybe just to be alone to pray. I believe Gethsemane was one of those places that he chose to go to because he knew it was a place of privacy. Let me just ask you today, do you have such a place? Do you have that kind of lonely place that you can go to and pray when you're faced with the struggle? When you begin to feel that struggle to do what God has called you to do, is there a lonely place that you can go to and pray? Because, again, Jesus is our example, and if Jesus saw the need to get away when he was faced with this struggle, to go to a lonely place where there was no one else around but his disciples, don't you think we can learn a lesson there? That maybe when we're faced with a struggle to do what God has called us to do, it's not a good thing to stay in the busyness of life and around the crowds, but to get away so we can be alone with Jesus as we experience the struggle. I think that's the lesson, that one of the lessons that we can learn here from Jesus. And I just want to say, if you don't have such a place, I want to urge you to get one based on the life example of Jesus Christ. If Jesus, again, withdrew to lonely places on a frequent basis, we also must do that as God's people. And so we discover that when Jesus was faced with the struggle between the flesh and the spirit to do what God had called him to do, he found a lonely place to pray. The reality is that some struggles can only be won in quiet places of prayer. The second thing I want us to discover today is the people. We've seen the place, I want us to see the people. Once Jesus and the disciples get to Gethsemane, Jesus says to them, "Sit here while I go and pray." However, before Peter, James, and John could take a seat, Jesus says to them, "I want you to come with me." Verse 37 says, he took Peter and the two sons of Zebedee along with him. Now, one of the things that becomes clear when you study the Gospels, when you study the life and ministry of Jesus, is that he had a closer relationship with these three disciples than he did with all the others. Now, that doesn't mean he loved them more than the others. It does mean that Jesus loved them uniquely than he did the others. Now, this would be one of those occasions where Jesus loved them uniquely. Matthew tells us that Jesus takes these three along with him further into the garden, and Jesus says to them, "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Stay here and keep watch with me." Now, the phrase "overwhelmed with sorrow" that Jesus uses here describes an intense discomfort. The sorrow that Jesus had in his heart was so intense that he added this exclamation. He said, "to the point of death." Now, I don't think sorrow can be any more intense than to the point of death. Do you? And I got to tell you something today. I have never experienced that kind of sorrow. I've never been able to say that I'm so sorrowful to the point of death. And yet we find Jesus right here saying, here's my heart is so overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. When Luke writes about this moment in his gospel, he shares with us a visual of how intense Jesus' sorrow was. Luke 22:44 says, and being in anguish, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat was like drops of blood falling to the ground. May I ask you today, have you ever been in such anguish that your sweat was like drops of blood falling to the ground? Luke's background was that of a doctor, and so it isn't surprising that he would share this information that Jesus' sweat was like drops of blood. There's an actual medical condition known as permidrosis in which people sweat blood. And I want to share with you what Dr. Frederick Zugabe describes when he writes about it. He said there are many blood vessels around our sweat glands. They form a sort of net surrounding the gland. If these vessels are put under great stress, the vessels constrict. When they release from this pressure, they expand until they rupture. The blood molecules spread out, and since they're so close to the sweat glands, they enter it. When the person sweats, the sweat washes the blood out of the sweat gland and onto the skin. The sweat is not only made up of blood, but has enough in it to appear red. And he goes on to say, typically high levels of stress on a person will cause the stress on the blood vessels. When Jesus walked into that garden, he did so under extreme distress. Jesus knew that what he had been called to do. He knew that once he left the Mount of Olives, the next hill that he would be on would be Mount Calvary, where he would die for the sin of the world. There he would suffer. There he would die. And when Jesus walked into that garden, there was a struggle going on between his flesh and his spirit. And the one thing that I want to point out is that Jesus shared that struggle with those closest to him. Jesus, he didn't keep the struggle to himself, but instead he chose to share that struggle with Peter and James and John. You say, well, why would he do that? I mean, why would Jesus share the struggle that he was experiencing? Why would he share it with Peter, James, and John? I think it's because he wanted them, as he said, I want you to keep watch with me, and I want you to sympathize with me best you can. I don't think these men could fully sympathize with Jesus. In fact, I don't know that any of us could fully sympathize with what Jesus was getting ready to experience. Yes, he was going to experience the physical suffering of the cross, but more than that, I mean, other men had been placed on crosses. But no man had ever been placed on a cross and had the sins of the world placed on him. And so Jesus not only had the physical pain going on, but he also had the spiritual pain going on as well. And so Jesus, he asked these men to keep watch with him because he wanted them to sympathize with him best they could. And I think there's a good lesson that we can learn here from Jesus when we're struggling with what God wants us to do, what he's called us to do. We need to share that struggle with those closest to us. Galatians 6:2 says we are to carry each other's burdens. And that's what we find Jesus giving these three men an opportunity to do for him, to carry his burden. The life of Jesus, it teaches us that when we are in a struggle, we should go to lonely places to pray, but that doesn't mean we're to struggle alone. You know, so often we think we've got to go through the struggle all by ourselves. Let me just say that Satan wants us to go through the struggle by ourselves. I mean, when you're struggling to do what God has called you to do, listen, there's nothing more perfect for the enemy to say, yeah, why don't you go over there and struggle all by yourself? You don't need anybody to help carry your burdens. You've got this. But we don't see that in the example of Jesus. We see Jesus when he's faced with this struggle to do what God has called him to do. We find him sharing that burden with those closest to him. And I think that's a good lesson for all of us. You going through a struggle today? You struggle to do what God has called you to do? Share it with those closest to you. You know who you're close to. You know who you can trust. You know who you can depend upon. You know who will truly carry your burden. Share that struggle with them. Because that's what Jesus did. And so we see the place, we see the people. The third thing I want us to discover today is the prayer. After telling Peter, James, and John to keep watch with him, Matthew tells us that Jesus finally gets down to the reason for coming to the garden in the first place. And I mean that figuratively and literally. Verse 39 says, going a little further, he fell with his face to the ground and he prayed. And I want you to hear what Jesus prays. Jesus didn't get all fancy. Wasn't some complicated prayer. This is what Jesus says. When he was faced with a struggle, Jesus simply prayed, my Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me. Now, what cup is he talking about? Well, the cup that he's talking about is this cup of suffering that was waiting for him the next day on the cross. Jesus' flesh really didn't want to experience that suffering. But remember, the flesh is all about that which is naturally pleasing, that which is naturally fulfilling. The flesh prefers to take the road of least resistance, the road of ease, the road of comfort. The cross was going to be anything but that. And so in the flesh, Jesus cries out to the Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me. And that phrase, if it is possible, most likely reflects what is known in the Greek as a first-class condition, which assumes that it is possible. Here we find Jesus affirming the omnipotence of God the Father. It was possible for God the Father to take this cup from Jesus in the sense that he is all-powerful and therefore he had the power to do so. But Jesus also knew that while it was possible for God the Father to take the cup from him, that didn't necessarily mean that it was Jesus or that it was God's will to do so. And as a result, Jesus continues his prayer. I want you to listen to this. This was it. Jesus said, if it's possible, take this cup from me. God, I know you're omnipotent, you're all-powerful, yet, not as I will, but as you. God, I know that you have the power to take this cup from me, but I also realize that it might not be within your will. So, God, whatever your will is, I'm your servant. Amen. Not my will, God, your will be done. In the moment that Jesus prayed that prayer, this struggle was going on in the doorway of Jesus' heart between the spirit and the flesh. And it was a struggle that ended the moment that Jesus prayed, not as I will, but as you will. The struggle ended just like that. At that moment, self-surrendered, the flesh lost, and the spirit won. When we find ourselves struggling to do what God has called us to do, when that struggle is occurring in the doorway of our heart between our flesh and our spirit, we need to find ourselves face down before God in prayer, understanding that while God has the power to change the call that he has placed on our life, it might not necessarily be within his will to do so. And so what do? When we're faced with this struggle between the flesh and the spirit, we do what Jesus did. We say, not as I will, God. Not as I will, but as you. I'm not here to please myself. I'm not here to please my flesh. My spirit is willing, God. Whatever you want to do, my life belongs to you, God. And that's what Jesus prayed. And I want to tell you, the moment that we say to God, not as I will, but as you will, the moment we do that, the struggle ends. Why? Because self surrenders, the flesh loses, and the spirit wins. God knows whether or not we're truly willing, if it's just words that we're saying, or if it's truly coming from a willing heart and a willing spirit. We can deceive a lot of people, but God sees our heart. Everything that's hidden within us, God knows. He knows if we're just blowing smoke for people. But listen, you can't hide anything from God. When you say, God, not as I will, but as you will, he knows whether you truly mean it.
That's right. Amen.
And I want to tell you, if you truly mean it, you'll follow through, won't you? Did Jesus follow through the next day? Yeah, he followed through. Why? Because he meant what he prayed that day in the garden. He meant it when he said, God, I don't want to do what I will. I want to do what you will. And he followed through. And so the proof is always in the follow through. It's not necessarily what we say with our mouth. It's what we do with our life. called Spirit-filled living, or living by the Spirit. Paul writes in Galatians 5:16 and 17, "So I say, live by the Spirit, and you will not gratify the desires of the sinful nature. For the sinful nature desires what is contrary to the Spirit, and the Spirit what is contrary to the sinful nature. They are in conflict with each other." That's that struggle that goes on every single day between the Spirit and the flesh. When we live by the Spirit, the flesh doesn't have a chance. Doesn't have a chance. The struggle ends with the prayer of surrender to God. So we've seen the place, the people, the prayer. Very quickly, the last thing I want us to see from this passage today is the powerless. The powerless. Jesus, he finishes praying, and Matthew tells us that he returns to where he had left Peter, James, and John. And what did he told them to do? Keep watch. Keep watch. And when he comes back, he finds them sleeping. He doesn't find them keeping watch. He finds them snoring. And after sharing with them the extreme sorrow of his heart, Jesus thought for sure he would return and find his disciples praying, not sleeping. I mean, can you imagine? Here Jesus pours out his heart to them. He says, guys, I'm so sorrowful that I'm almost to the point of death. You would think that when they heard those words, they could stay awake for Jesus. I mean, right? I mean, here Jesus bears his soul to them and says, guys, this is extremely sorrowful for me. Can't you just watch it? And he thought he'd come back, and there they would be praying. Instead, they're just like this. And Jesus says to them, he says, could you men not keep watching with me for 1 hour? Just 1 hour. Watch and pray so that you will not fall into temptation. Get what Jesus says. The Spirit's willing. Just like our Spirit's willing so many times. Because a spirit that is alive unto God, it's willing. But what's the problem? Jesus addresses the problem. He says, but the body's weak. And so Jesus leaves the disciples. He returns to pray. He comes back, and what's he find? Sleeping again. And I want to tell you something. I don't feel quite as bad anymore when I leave on Sundays. I'm thinking if Jesus Christ himself could not keep people awake. I'm just saying. Because at the end of the day, he's the one that keeps us focused, isn't he?
Amen. That's right.
So Jesus, he leaves, returns to praying, comes back a third time. The disciples are still sleeping. Because the disciples were sleeping, I want you to get this today. Because they were sleeping instead of watching, they missed a wonderful opportunity to learn from Jesus how to have victory over weak body. In a few hours, the disciples are going to be called by God to do something. All of them were going to be called to do something. They were going to be called to identify with Jesus and follow him to the cross. And only one of them would fulfill that call. And that was John. The rest of them turned their backs on Jesus and run away. They don't identify with Jesus. Peter, what's Peter do? How many times? Isn't it interesting that Peter denied him 3 times and Jesus found him sleeping how many times? I want you to open up your Bible. Matthew 26. I'm closing things down, but this is, I don't know if you've ever noticed this or not. Do you think it's significant that in verse 40 it says, then he returned to his disciples and found them sleeping, and he said, could you men not keep watch with me for 1 hour? He asked who? Peter. Who was the one man who said, I will die for you, Jesus. I will go. I mean, when all the other people turn their back and run, oh, you can count on me, Jesus. Jesus says, I want to tell you before the rooster crows, you're going to deny me 3 times. I believe with all my heart that had Peter kept watch and prayed, he would have seen exactly how to have victory over a weak body. He would have been able to do what Jesus did. He would have, when that struggle occurred, he would have been able to look because he had seen Jesus in the garden. He saw how Jesus had victory, and he could have looked to Jesus as the example, and he would have had victory because his spirit was willing, but his flesh was weak. And so I just want to say today, we got to stay awake. When given the opportunity to hear from Jesus, to look to him as our example, we've got to stay awake because Jesus knows what we're going to face tomorrow. And the word that we're hearing today might be the word that helps us have victory tomorrow.
That's right. Amen.
I'm closing up, I promise, because I know the hour is late.
Keep going, man. Keep going.
No, I really am. But I want you to hear this today.
Blessing God.
Preach, man.
Blessing Lord.
We're going to be faced with struggles. Jesus wants us to have victory.
Amen.
So let me just ask you today, are you in a struggle? I don't want you to answer that out loud, but are you in a struggle today? Is there something that you know that God has called you to do, and there's been this struggle between your flesh and your spirit? I mean, your spirit's willing, but there's that battle going on at the doorway of your heart. Let me ask you this question. Have you found a lonely place to go and pray about it? Have you shared the struggle with those closest to you? Don't try to struggle alone. And have you said to God the prayer of surrender, not as I will, but as you will, and truly meant it in your heart? Today, I hope that none of you were sleeping. As we found ourselves with Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, I hope you were watching how Jesus prayed the struggle to an end. Because the struggles are going to come. I face them all the time, ladies and gentlemen. There are struggles that I face, just like you face, where I know God has called me to do something, and my spirit is saying, yes, Jesus, yes, Jesus, yes, Jesus. I'm on the way, I'm on the way out, and the spirit, or the flesh meets me. Now think about this, Travis. Do you really want to do that? And then this struggle happens. And I would like to tell you that every time I've been victorious, that I have. And I want to be. I want to be where Jesus wants me to be, doing what Jesus wants me to do.
Amen.
Because time is fleeting, ladies and gentlemen. I was thinking about something. All the things that have transpired this week. Meredith and Joey Feet. She's my age. And as I thought about her life, it was like the Spirit said to me, we're all racing to a finish line. And some of us are going to get there sooner than we thought. See, the reality about all of us in this room today is we're headed toward a finish line. The day's going to come where our life on this earth is going to come to an end. We think we have all the time in the world, but some of us are going to cross that finish line sooner than we expected, and we've got to be ready for that day.
That's right.
I can tell you, I'm ready for that day. How am I ready? I know Jesus. He's my Savior. He's my Lord. I live in an earthly tent, but I have an eternal home that I'm going to. And if you're sitting here today and you're counting on tomorrow, you better think again. Because you are not promised tomorrow. And if you don't know Jesus, you've been playing around, been playing church, playing the Pharisee thing, I want to tell you something. Jesus died to save your soul because He doesn't want to spend eternity separated from you. He wants to live with you forever in this wonderful place that He's created. Sin caused this earth all to mess up and it's broken. And listen, but Jesus fixed it for us when He went to the cross, when He was placed in the tomb, when He rose again. He fixed it for us, and there's a place where we'll never experience that again. I'm headed there. I'm headed there.
Amen.
When I cross the finish line on this earth, I know where I'm going to be. Are you ready to cross the finish line? I know don't want to play around. Your soul is too important to Jesus for me to play around. So if you don't know Jesus, during this time of invitation, you make your way down here. You trust Him as your Savior, because you're headed toward the finish line. It's destined for every man to die once. And after that, to face judgment. I want to tell you, the judgment of God doesn't rest on me anymore, because it rests on Jesus. I accepted Him as my Savior and Lord, so He took my judgment. But I want to tell you, if you've never accepted Jesus, the judgment of God rests on you today, and that's nothing to make light of. So would you give your life to Jesus today? Would you trust Him as your Savior and your Lord? Yeah, there's a struggle going on in your heart right now between the flesh and the spirit. That's the biggest struggle you'll ever face, because the devil wants you to, he wants you to spend eternity with him. Don't miss it. Say, I surrender today to you, Jesus. Every head bowed, every eye closed, nobody looking around.